Okay, great. Thank you all for being here and many more who are watching online right now. Thanks for joining us virtually from New York City, where Columbia is, and all over the world. My name is Jason Bordoff. I am the co-founding dean of the Columbia Climate School, the director of the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia. Our topic today is a really important one. We know this is the decisive decade for climate action. Time for all of us, governments, civil society, business, and yes, academia also, to step up and recommit ourselves to doing all that we can aligned with the urgency and prioritization of the climate challenge. At Columbia University, we are doing just that, building on the history of excellence at Columbia in climate and energy, including the Center on Global Energy Policy, now the new climate school, to create an entirely new school focused on education, research, and knowledge-based solutions that are needed to tackle the hardest climate change problems. And one of those is our topic of discussion for today, mobilizing private capital for climate action in the developing and emerging markets. These are parts of the world that use almost no energy at all, that will suffer some of the worst impacts of climate change, that because they use very little energy are not responsible for the cumulative emissions to date, most of them, that have few resources to deal with the impacts of climate, and that have few resources to finance the transition to a cleaner energy future. So there's been a lot of focus in the lead up to this COP about whether developed nations will fulfill a pledge for 100 billion a year to developing nations made in 2009. And 100 billion is a rounding error compared to the $1 to $2 trillion a year that is estimated to be needed for investment in clean energy in emerging and developing economies. By contrast, last year was about 150 billion was the amount spent on clean energy investment in the developing world. Most of that, those trillions, will need to be private capital, but government can help, and government can help catalyze that private investment. And that is the topic of the discussion today. To lead that conversation, I'm really delighted to turn the floor over to tonight's moderator, Lauren Cochran. She is the Vice President of Equity and Investment Funds for the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. She's worked in the field of international development with a focus on sub-Saharan Africa for many years, previously at Blue Haven Initiative, Imprint Capital, and the Clinton Foundation. And I can think of no one better to lead our conversation today than her. I'll turn it over to her and let her introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Hi guys, so I am working from a number of different things here, but I'm delighted to be here. So I am on my 33rd day at the DFC, so I'll do my best to get in all the things and might ask for my colleagues to punch me if I've missed anything. But just to tell you a little bit about DFC to start off, I am in charge of our Office of Equity and Investment Funds, which is a relatively new line of business. We are now able to put capital to work in the equity space, which, if you know DFC, formerly OPIC, we were really focused on debt. So now we can be LPs and invest in all different parts of the equity capital stack directly into companies. We in this last year have made pretty big bets in the climate arena. We've pledged to be net zero by 2040 and to do 1/3 of our investments will be climate linked by the year 2023. We have also decided to create a technical assistance facility called the Climate Action Facility that will enable grants to get earlier stage climate initiatives off the ground. And so these are important initiatives for us as an organization, for the US government. I have a few sort of logistical things to remind everybody of before we get started here. This is a live webcast. The full video will be available at some later date. For those who are joining us via Zoom, you can submit questions online. In the room, people can just raise their hands and we'll repeat the questions up here and we'll probably go back and forth. I am now going to turn it over to Ali Zaidi for opening remarks, who is the Deputy White House National Climate Advisor.
Thanks, Lauren, and thank you, Jason, for pulling this group together. Jake and Aparna and others from the DFC and greater US government family for your leadership in advancing this work. I want to just start out as an advisor to President Biden on the domestic side, bring some lessons and some insights from that conversation into this one, because I think that's, at least for the president, part of what grounds the sense of opportunity that defines this space. When we look across the United States, and I was actually seated next to someone at dinner the other night who was surprised to hear this, that the impacts of a changing climate fall disproportionately, even in the United States, on Black and brown communities, on lower income communities. Oftentimes, folks live in those low-lying areas that tend to be lower income. Those are the places more likely to be flooded as the sea levels rise and the hurricanes become more fierce and more severe. And not only are the impacts felt disproportionately, one of the things we find is that the opportunity to take on this crisis does not reach in a proportional way either. You look at the companies that have boomed over the last several decades, we'd probably be hard pressed to find folks who use that as a ticket into the middle class or into prosperity. We look at the workforce, and we are struggling to build in the wages and the benefits that we've come to enjoy in other parts of the economy in this emerging one, but we have conviction that we will do that. So when the president says build back better at home, what he's talking about is not only an economy that's racing to net zero, but an economy that is taking the opportunity of this shift to net zero to take on these deep-seated challenges that have plagued us for hundreds of years. Disproportionate effects, the way economics has broken and built, literally redlined folks out of a healthy environment. Just another example, in the United States, we used to redline communities based on essentially race. And that's how housing got built out. And today, those old red line communities are literally hotter because there is more pavement and less tree cover than their comparable communities. So here's why I raise all of that, is because when we look overseas and we think about building the world back better after this pandemic and this challenging set of economic headwinds that we've faced over the last several years, we know that we need to not only raise ambition on net zero and race in that direction, but that we also need to attack those underlying issues of inequality. I think about the country where I was born before my parents decided to make the trek to the United States, in Pakistan, where those low-lying areas exist. Those farmers with lack of access to irrigation and adequate water exist. And where it's been a struggle over the last several years and decades to create that market for renewables and make sure it reaches as a force for economic prosperity for more and more people. So as we think about building back, we've got to keep those considerations front of mind, just as we think about emissions and greenhouse gas. Here's the role that public capital can play. I'm really glad Lauren talked about how the DFC is broadening its toolkit, not only to do the end stage deployment finance, but really start early. Here's why this matters. Because we can't just talk about deploying these technologies in the countries around the world. We've got to help grow the capacity to manufacture them, create those supply chains so that we're more diverse as a world in how we fulfill our demand for things like solar and wind and batteries, the technologies that are going to power the next several decades. So that's part of the remit here, is not only how do you put the training wheels on private capital to get it in the game, to deploy the gigawatts of solar and wind, the retrofits that we're going to need in the building sector and in the power sector. But how do you get private capital to feel comfortable building those organic capacities in these countries all around the world? I look at the example of what the DFC has been able to do in the face of this pandemic. We were caught flat-footed, I think, around the world on the challenges that we faced from COVID-19. But I'm proud to say that the DFC has been on the front lines of helping build capacity for not just deploying vaccines, but developing and manufacturing those vaccines all around the world. That's the model we need to harness when we think about this next crisis, the climate crisis that's upon us. We can't just be deploying those technologies, we got to be building them as well. Now, private capital, I think, has stepped up in many ways, but I'll close on this with the healthy dose of skepticism. There's a healthy dose of skepticism about what that means. And let's be very clear. When we talk about, and again, I can't sort of divorce from my domestic experience, when we talk about the responsibilities that private corporations have to the people from whom they've been able to do business, the people they brought together to help grow our economy. You know, we talk about investment in our roads and bridges. We say companies have to pay their fair share. And it's very easy, you know, you don't manufacture a road or a bridge. And so you say, well, why would I have to pay taxes to build a road or a bridge? You do, because you benefit from it. And in that same way, private capital for centuries has benefited from a stable climate. And as that stable climate destabilizes, it's on private capital to get in the game and provide the resources that are going to be necessary, in part because of the self-interest of that capital, the duties it owes to the source from which it comes, to invest in the things that are going to get us back to a more stable environment. But here's the thing. We know that private capital has different levels of risk appetite. And I think we've got to be facilitating, especially the United States by its example, and the EU and others who have been stepping to the fore of making those inroads and creating those conditions. There are markets around the world where we're still having price discovery on a lot of these technologies. We're far from knowing even what it really costs to go to scale. So we've got to facilitate that through first loss, through equity investments, other creative approaches. This is the moment to do that. Let me just close and say, one, just thrilled to hear what all these brilliant people have to say, to be with all of you, and know from the United States that for President Biden, this commitment to driving to net zero in a way that brings everyone together and moves all of us forward together, that's a commitment he has domestically. It's a commitment he has all around the world. Our newest agency, the DFC, is an example of how we will do that around the world and build back better. Thank you.
So I'm going to invite our panelists up here. We have Anne Finucane from Bank of America, Mark Gologly from Three Karens, Dr. Usman from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Ailun Yang from Bloomberg Philanthropies. And I'm going to let you each give a 1-minute introduction. Stand up here. Great.
Hello, everyone. Good day. My name is Zainab Osman, and I'm the director of the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. At the Carnegie Endowment, we are focused on the issues that we think are crucial to Africa's future. We're a bit forward-looking in that sense. So we're focused on climate change, which is a very, very important issue for Africa, technology, digital technologies, and also very importantly, the changing investment landscape in Africa. So looking forward to this discussion.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Galogli. I've spent the last 35 years as an investor, and the most recent 6 months, I was working for John Kerry, trying to build a team focused on finance, and have started an organization called, I've since left that position and started an organization called Three Karens with my wife, which is focused on climate, on investing, on philanthropy, and on policy. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ann Finucane. I'm Vice Chair of Bank of America and Chairman of Bank of America Europe. But my day job is to oversee our climate finance and ESG work.
My name is Ailun Yang. I work at Bloomberg Philanthropies. I oversee our international initiatives, including energy transition, air pollution, and sustainable finance. Thank you.
Great. And just as a reminder, we are talking about how to mobilize finance into emerging markets, mainly for climate action, but I think a lot of this will probably be transferable. And everybody on the panel is coming at this from either from a wealthier nation or from an emerging market. And I think that the opportunities are different. There are opportunities in both regions, but when you talk about wealthier nations, adaptation, mitigation, resilience, we have to do all of the things because we have existing infrastructure that may or may not hold up as we move to a world that is getting hotter by the year. And in emerging markets, there is an opportunity to build infrastructure and other climate change investment that is actually already adapted, resilient, and mitigated. And so I would love to hear from each of the panelists kind of where you see the entry points for the private sector finance, where you're coming from right now around climate change. And then we'll talk about the public sector, because I think what's clear is that there's not enough money from either end of the spectrum, and we need to work together. So I'd love to hear just examples of how each of your organizations are thinking about this from a private sector perspective.
Do you want me to
Yeah,
start?
I was going to ask, why don't we start?
Okay. Well, there are some realities that are being discussed here at COP, but I'll just take the financial institutions. At least 34, maybe now more, of the 50 largest financial institutions in the world have committed to net zero. For them to be net zero, that means every client, every customer has to be, actually every vendor has to be net zero. So that's a pretty big task. And then what are the ways to make sure there's not greenwashing? Well, there's disclosure. I think that we will see TCFD take a larger role. I'm sure the SEC will pass some new rules. Oh, you probably know better than I do, but I think it will have its basis around TCFD plus probably, which means we're disclosing our climate emissions and also the work behind it. That's really important because otherwise no one's going to believe it. Then the question is, how do you get there? Well, you have to do an audit on every company as well as your own. For the foreseeable years ahead, I don't think anyone gets to net zero, let alone carbon neutrality, which means your own operations, scope 1 and 2. The delta is dealt with at the moment by buying offsets. The offsets are too small because they're forestation in Uganda or the Amazon. It's not enough. My own feeling is we should create carbon credits, aggregate the money, and take that money from all these companies and underwrite the very things you're talking about in the developing world. But in the meantime, there are things going on. Actually, with DFC, we're doing a program. You can just stick with me here for a minute. There's a group called Water Equity, or water.org. Water.org provides micro lending at the very, very community level throughout parts of India, formerly in South America, and now they're with Latin America, and now they're moving into parts of Africa. So these microloans are done at a local level, and they create a well and they create water that would otherwise not be available. They have scaled their efforts to create a fund. Water Equity is a fund which we worked with them on their first $10 million effort, which was hard to do and very few people wanted to invest, but actually they have invested and it gives a 3% return. But DFC is what made it possible to, we worked with DFC on a $100 million fund. DFC is essentially guaranteeing the debt, which is half of it, which is the part the bank will take on. And then that allows equity investors to come in, and knowing the debt's already covered, it becomes a much more appealing vehicle for them. So I already see partnerships, that partnership would not have happened 3 years ago.
Great, yeah. You were just talking about sort of the role of philanthropy in climate change in our last session, so I'd love to hear.
Sure,
Next,
yes.
Yeah.
So if we count philanthropy also as part of the private sector, then maybe I can talk about how we see the difference between wealthy nations and developing nations when it comes to climate finance. I think that coming back to the role of philanthropy, in a nutshell, philanthropy either try to create pressure to create the demand for action, or try to be helpful. That's how normally we try to have impacts or make some difference. And I think in developed country, of course, the focus right now would be a lot more on try to create pressure, because the country governments here are in many ways a lot more capable and will be able to get a lot of things done. However, I mean, in our work, we're also quite surprised to see that when we come to local level, then it's actually also a quite different situation. So there's actually a lot of those capacities also need to be built on the local level, especially on the city level. Even what we saw the painful experience was during the Obama administration, where there was also the availability of a lot of funding for climate actions, but a lot of them were not used so effectively, mainly because of the lack of capacity on the local level. And I think that's something that we are also trying to work on. But in developing country, then there's a lot more we need to do. It's not sufficient to say that just to create pressure. I think that the demand for capacity, no matter it's in terms of the analytical capacity or it's in terms of really getting projects together, pipeline more prepared, or even nowadays there's a lot more conversation about blended finance, what role philanthropy can play in actually investing in those projects and get them going faster. These are things that we are considering. Let me also just say that another role of private philanthropy is, of course, in convening, and I think I mentioned the alliance of the new alliance, the global, the GFANS, the Glasgow alliance of net zero financial alliance. That's of course a very exciting thing. I think that we see that a lot of the private sector financial players actually taking action. However, I want to say that it's really important to talk about what role they can play in accelerating things, but also very important to talk about what are the things that really we should stop doing, such as the funding fossil fuel projects, no matter it's coal-fired plants or expansion of oil and gas. I think that how to also address those kind of disconnection between these actions. I think that's also important to make sure that there's accountability built into these initiatives.
Great. And Mark, I'm curious on your work, because you were sort of more wealthy nation focused for a long time and now have started to dive into emerging markets. Where do you see kind of your entry point into this conversation?
When you say I was more wealthy nation focused, what that means is, as an investor, I was investing mostly in North America and in Europe.
Correct. Yeah.
And biggest possible picture, the money is needed in the developing world more than it's needed in North America for Europe for climate. And so the question becomes, how do we do that? For example, Eileen just mentioned GFANS, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Okay?
Bingo.
Good work.
Better than me.
It's $135 trillion that has been and Anne played a key role in this, lined up and committed to be net zero. Now, there's a lot of room between that statement and reality, right? We all know there's a lot that has to be done. But one of the core things, there are two quick comments I'd make about that. These are in dollars. The money is often needed, as someone just reminded us from the African Development Bank earlier today. Waleed, he reminded us, the money is needed in local currency. And for those of you who study economics, these are very different things. If you're a dollar-based asset owner and you have to lend in local currency, how do you cover that risk? So that's a simple but very important aspect to this. So for me, on a personal basis, I'm interested in going with where the problem is the largest and the opportunity therefore is largest, and the largest opportunity resides in the developing world in terms of providing some help as much as you can around finance on this issue.
Yes, so the work that I do is on climate change is really around identifying opportunities that can be harnessed in African countries, but also risks that can and should be mitigated around climate change and the transition. And this is for African stakeholders, policymakers, and also their partners, whether it's bilateral partners in the US or the UK or elsewhere. So that work that we're doing, what we're realizing is that when we talk about entry points for private capital, it will be very essential to try to do things differently from what I would call the oil era, the 4 to 6 decade period in which there was in fact, to date, a lot of investment flows to African countries, but certain mistakes were made. So those mistakes would have to be avoided. And there are 3 things I can mention on that front in terms of thinking about entry points. So the first thing is, in terms of thinking about, avoiding those mistakes and doing things differently, is that investors should see the problem as the opportunity in many countries. And what do I mean by that? So sometimes when you look at some of the statistics on different sectors or industries or areas in Africa, they're quite alarming. But that is actually the opportunity, right? So electricity access is still under 50%. Clean cooking, clean energy solutions still under 20% actually in Africa. Mass transit systems, across the board, you look at that and you get scared, but that is actually the opportunity. And there's hard evidence and data to back this up. So one example I would give is with respect to Chinese investors in mobile phone companies. So in the early 2000s, certain companies in European and North American countries, I'm not gonna put any company on the spot, did their assessments and decided that Africans were too poor to own mobile phones and didn't focus on African markets. And in the early 2000s, you had companies like Nokia, for example, which had market share. But then by the 2010s, when you had Chinese investors making headway in Africa, that dynamic shifted completely to the extent that today, Transsion, which is a Chinese company, has 47 or 48% market share for smartphones in Africa. So that's just one example. So the problem is the opportunity. That's number one. Number two is that I think investors really need to think about working with local partners in African countries. Because when you work with local partners, you're able to quickly navigate challenges in the operating environment. I'm sure the business environment is not very easy to navigate. But when you work with local partners, they know that environment and they can help you navigate it. The African continent has a lot of entrepreneurs. In Nigeria, for example, micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises, there are over 41 million of them. The majority of them are actually micro enterprises that less than 10 people and have a capital base of less than $30,000. So work with local partners, and there are initiatives that have come up over the past couple of years around local content in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Angola, where you try to ensure that foreign investments have backward linkages to the rest of the economy with, for example, sourcing inputs from the local economy. And very quickly, the third point I'm going to mention is to really focus on knowledge, technology, and skills transfer in African countries, because what seems to have happened over the past 4 to 6 decades is that, unlike Asia, where foreign investments were kind of accompanied by technology upgrading, skills upgrading, we've not necessarily seen that in many African countries. So this is something that can be done differently. And I think the public sector, governments can also help on this front. So those are the 3 things I'll mention in terms of entry points.
Perfect. That's an excellent segue, actually, into the discussion about, we're sitting here at COP, and but every government, some of them are still around, every public sector actor here with a lot of money. And I think the numbers that I've heard, this is $1 trillion investment. That's $1 trillion that we need to stick to 1.5 degrees over the next, decade. And but actually, it's a $23 trillion economic opportunity. I think the thing about both of those numbers is that the private sector is not going to bring that amount of money to the table, and so we need the public sector on this stage with this going up on the internet. What would you guys ask the private sector for, based on what you've done? And anything, get creative, and we'll do what we can to think about it. But I'm curious if there are things that have worked well, actually, that you've actually seen, or things, to your earlier point, that haven't worked well and that we should avoid in the future. But I don't know if anyone wants to start, but yeah.
Well, yeah, but I'm the private sector, so.
I know, but what do you want from the public sector? Yeah.
Well, just to speak to this last issue. There is an opportunity, but there's big risk. So that's how business sees opportunity. What is the risk reward? And things that are investment grade, you can do for less interest, less capital put down. And those that have lots of issues with it can cost more. So that seems unfair. The way to deal with it, I think, and this has been the discussion in the Blue Zone for the last 48 hours, is blended finance, where you can put in various tranches of capital. So what does that mean? That means philanthropy. Philanthropic dollars don't expect a return other than in societal outcome, but they're not looking for cash. Commercial banks are not big risk takers, but they don't need a lot of interest either. They'll take something less, like something return of a municipal bond, which would be 2 or 3%. And then so on and so forth. So you get up to private equity, which will take a big risk, but wants a big return. And the value of doing that is you're all going in together and you mitigate the risk with those bottom tranches, with the particularly with philanthropy or with a multi-development bank. If you can do a multilateral development bank, you can do a regular bank. If you can do philanthropy, then you can get some of the risk taken out. And we were trying this, meaning public and private were trying this earlier on. And we'd actually have success, but it would take us forever to do it. And then we couldn't repeat it. It didn't have any, it wasn't a construct we could keep repeating. It seems to have new attraction. One is because we're going to have to do these carbon credits, so maybe we could use those as essentially tithing to put in. Or the other is just a new one that Bill Gates is doing, this Breakthrough Catalyst Fund. We're an investor in that. It's philanthropic dollars, it's banks, it's asset managers, and we're all taking various risks, but the overall output will be a lower return than we're used to, but for a greater good. And this is essentially not only technology and investment in new research, but maybe even a more important thing, which is how to deal with those old, fossil fuel companies, because it's really stopping that, and also more prosaic stuff like cement and steel, things that to build anything, to create any kind of new construction you need. So
I think I want to just jump in one thing. Just to frame the dollars for a minute. These numbers are so large, it's almost inconceivable, okay? But the IEA, the IPCC, the Carney's group, everybody more or less has similar numbers that over 30 years, over the next 30 years, between now and 2050, we need to spend something like $100 trillion incremental to make this transition, of which 2/3 needs to be in the developing world. That's $3 trillion a year, okay? Ann's point is private sector capital wants a good risk-adjusted return, okay? That's what it's meant to achieve. So my own view is that the public sector needs to play a major role here.
in de-risking.
A major role in de-risking and in all other aspects of it. One way to frame it is that the public sector has invested since 2008 approximately $25 trillion in quantitative easing globally, okay? Because we had a financial crisis in 2008 and because we had COVID. And we have to really get our heads around the fact that this crisis is larger than either of those. And it's less time to deal with it. We have to really reimagine what our public sector institutions bring to the party. Those are in two ways. One is capital, just in general capital, and then is every dollar that we currently invest through the major multilateral institutions, the World Bank and all the other institutions. Every dollar is precious and needs to be invested wisely around things that motivate other levels of capital. This has not been their historic job. They've done great work for years and years and years in the developing world, but they've done it, the DFC and others, by not taking risk. They don't take risks. What do? They lend to governments, and then what do governments do? They pay them back or they don't get any more money, okay? So that's not risk-taking. That's allocation of capital to a government, okay? Now we need someone to take risks because not every party is capable of in returning the capital on a return basis, which is what the private sector demands. This requires a reimagination of what government does and how it works in partnership with private sector. And we don't have any time to waste. We need to think about that much more aggressively than we have been.
Just one thing, the IFC is trying to do this. That's the commercial part of
The World Bank.
the World Bank. And again, DFC is doing it with de-risking. So there are groups, so there are public sector.
That's totally right. That's a very good point. The thing is, it's small dollars. Okay, this is the entire budget of the DFC, the United States is the largest institution, the Development Finance Corporation of the United States. Its entire budget globally is $6 billion a year, of which 1/3 is climate, $2 billion. But what we're talking about is $3 trillion, not $2 billion. Okay, and so even if they do it really well, and even if they do it really intelligently, the IFC, which I agree with Dan on, and the DFC, both of which do great work, it's not to the right scale.
I was going to quibble with you that it's 6.7, but it's not the point. Yes, but I am going to warn everyone that we're going to open up to questions very shortly. So if you, okay, all right, registered, you can get one remarked.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to just add my thoughts still from the philanthropy perspective. I think that for philanthropy is the most nimble type of funding in the whole conversation. So naturally, we can take on more risks than any of the other players, things that government can't do, doesn't want to do, things that the private sector seeking profit and can't do. However, I think that the two things that philanthropy need to weigh, and that's maybe how I frame the request to the private sector. The first thing, I think that philanthropy trying to weigh is bringing back to what I was saying. The role of philanthropy is always trying to figure out whether we're trying to play a role to create pressure or whether we are trying to be helpful. And I think that in many cases, I think we're getting better at understanding how we create pressure. Often I think that that's how we understand the leverage we have. This is our job to try to raise attention to a certain problem and try to point out who might be the bad guy here, and then somebody else need to figure out how to deal with that. And I think that now that when we talk about actually going into the solution part of this, then it's about the impacts and how we actually decide. On the second side, the really the additionality of philanthropy dollar is often very difficult to measure. How can we say that we are making any difference with the $1 million in a 100 million deal on something? I think that is often quite difficult to measure, and I think that's kind of one question that we are considering. The second thing, and I think that this is also just if I frame this as a request, is that will be trying to understand whether we actually have an effective role to play in actually getting something happen instead of just on the outside and shouting something. The second thing that I think that philanthropy is trying to look for is scalability. Yeah, it's great if the philanthropy dollar can help going into a solar farm somewhere and make that happen. Whenever you see that, and there's a lot of examples of blended finance on that, it's normally quite small scale. Even if you do that, you know that normally it's going into a market and taking the best of potential project and make that happen. And it's very difficult to say that, well, what after that? How can this be replicated? Because it is a scarce resource, the type of flexibility funding. So I think, again, we should work together to figure out how we really scale this up. And on that front, I think the role of this player in between, I really want to point out, between philanthropy, purely nimble dollar, and the private sector that's profit-seeking dollar is the role of all the government funding, multilateral institutions, and they really need to play the facilitator's role in getting this going.
Yeah, we're going to try. Yes, quickly.
Yeah, we get 2 points in. Very excellent points made by my colleagues here on blended finance and the de-risking role that governments can play. I think 2 things that I would add to all those points are, first of all, I think governments, at least from the perspective, speaking on Africa, the countries that I cover, governments would need to do better at data collection. So data, I mean, this is a huge issue, but with respect to our discussion here on climate change, hydrometeorological data, to allow for modeling, which can help reduce risk, because we still don't know that much about weather patterns in Africa because we don't have the local data. That can really help. Also, very importantly, an area that interests me a lot is critical raw materials, critical minerals for clean energy technologies, solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and all of those. So the governments that want to attract investments to those areas, whether it's the lithium belt in the Sahel, West Africa, Central Africa, but also Southern Africa. I think it's very important to update their geological surveys. You'd be shocked at how many countries still don't have updated geological surveys. How can they attract investors when you don't have that? So they would, collection of relevant vital data is very, very important. Second point that I'll make is regional coordination among countries. So particularly some of the landlocked countries in Africa, right? They still need, whether it's access to ports from their coastal neighbors, or in certain cases, not every country needs to have, for example, a refinery for a particular mineral. Especially for the very small countries, they can kind of coordinate among themselves. So regional coordination is so important. It's such a no-brainer, but it doesn't happen well enough. So those are 2 things that I thought to add.
Thank you. Question in the audience, and I'm going to warn everyone here and online that if it's not a question, I will cut you off. So you in the back.
Hi, my name is Christine. I work with legal and general investment.
A little louder.
Let me project. My name is Christine. I work with legal and general investment management in London, and I have a question for Anne. I was hoping that you could elaborate a little bit on what you mentioned around blended finance, but how it takes a long time and it's been difficult to replicate. Like, what were the stumbling blocks that that you faced, and why is it so difficult to replicate?
And you only have a short period of time.
Okay, well,
Yes.
quickly, in the past, so we did a wind farm in the North Sea. That would be a good example. Or solar installations, residential in Spain. Well, this was a while back, so it already seemed to have a bigger risk because they didn't have a track record. Engaging financial institutions in wanting to do it when the return would be uncertain. Those are two really good reasons. And what makes it different now is the momentum around the technologies. So the technologies are established, that's better. The desire to participate, that's much better. And I think institutional shareholders and all shareholders pressure on companies to do something. That all helps.
And I would just add, I think, a bias to action, that we
Yeah.
have to start doing stuff rather than just talking about.
You know, one thing about blended finance, it requires someone to risk losing money.
Right.
No one likes losing money unless they're a philanthropy who's willing to lose money, and those parties aren't willing to lose a hell of a lot of it. Okay? So that's the biggest issue, is not the money that wants to be lost. And then the big institutions, the big global, World Bank, EFC, others, they don't want to lose any money. Okay, they really don't. So that's the reason.
Wait,
Blended,
their covenant doesn't let them. It's not like they just decide they can.
Right, Congress gets really mad at us.
Congress gets mad at us.
It's real. More questions, yeah.
Just following up on that point then, around that, I guess the biggest pools of private capital are the institutional investors, the pension funds, etc. How do we get them into the game in emerging markets where, you know, the risk and return profiles aren't right for them? You know, most just they see the words emerging markets and they run a mile. If there's not enough philanthropy to underpin blended finance to bring those guys in, what is there a solution? How do we get that capital?
And I'm gonna do this thing where I take a couple questions, not because it's not a good question, just because I see a lot of hands and we're gonna get some.
So what do you see the role of the emerging billionaire / philanthropists who also want to make money invested on these technologies?
Okay, great, and one more, yeah.
Yeah, my question is around biodiversity as well. So I think where the risk is sort of huge in biodiversity, but how can we invest in community-based solutions?
Okay, great. So getting the money from institutions with a big pool of capital.
big pools of capital are participating. They just want someone to take the junior risk, okay, the first loss. That I think Anne already covered, or I did. There are a couple of other ideas that have been raised. Cut off the tail risk. So for example, provide on a first project a guarantee around it, so you know it actually works. That was a suggestion earlier today from someone who I think was really onto something. And finally, we could keep going on this, but foreign exchange is a big risk. So maybe identify that, and some public sector player takes that risk. And then you'll see a pension fund, for example, take more risk.
Remember, a pension fund can't take risks because it's your pension. I mean, everyone wants to do it until they realize, oh, so I'd be getting less? No. So that's a reality. I still think this idea of taking the last mile of getting to carbon neutrality instead of doing offsets, which are controversial and people think they're greenwashing. But if you're transparent in it and you tell people exactly how the money is spent, so there's no question how it was used. And but when you put the money in, you're not guaranteed it back. It's a tithing. You're putting money in for the first loss or for concessionary capital. That essentially is bucking up the public sector, the governments, and allowing them to multiply anything they would do.
And I would just say that along with that bias towards action is that actually that the risk perception and the downside risk and the limited tail risk, that there's a perceived risk that is different from the risk in reality. So we actually have to go do something
Right.
and prove that we can get our money back.
Could I make one thing? Anne has written a paper on, an article on this in the New York Times or in the FT, I can't remember. In the FT. Okay, but the bottom line is, some people think about offsets. Offsets are really questionable according to many people, right? How come?
Well, they are
You-
questionable, actually, right?
Right, they're questionable for a lot of reasons. But in this case, what Anne is proposing is that you take cash out of your pocket, you put it into something,
Right.
real cash, as opposed to agreeing to plant trees or something else that is important, but is difficult to monitor. Cash is less difficult to monitor. And then that cash is utilized for the junior capital or for other risk issues.
Aggregated with lots of companies doing the same thing.
It's like in many countries, they might putting up a carbon tax or something that
Right.
would generate that cash flow to help with this. And we don't expect developing countries to be able to do that, and therefore that amount of cash need to come from them. Then you also take the question about what about philanthropies also want to make money from those new emerging technologies? Well, I mean, first of all, that's one way to spend a philanthropy dollar, and I think that there's hopefully if that those funding actually get some of those technologies mature faster, hopefully that's a good thing. However, I think what is maybe I wouldn't say problematic, but also what we need to be careful about is we do have the majority of technology ready to solve a very big part of the climate problem. I think the obsession with this last mile of technologies, and think that's where all the no matter it's philanthropy or private sector money all need to crowd into, that actually take away the focus and pressure on government to do the right thing. Because the problem to really get the majority of proven technologies grow in most of the market is we don't yet have the right enabling environment. And I think that's it's a great kind of addition to the climate action, but I feel like it's quite important for us to actually be focusing on the majority of proven things and how we actually get them going.
Yep. Question.
So my question is really about the big emerging markets in Africa, specifically Nigeria and South Africa. I wanted Dr. Osman to answer this. So how do we deal with the problem of readiness, especially, I'm sure you've come across this article by the Vice President of Nigeria, talking about Nigeria's reluctance to digress from natural gas. So how do we deal with the problem of the public sector risk of lack of readiness, even though the money is there to invest in green techs? How do we get the public sector to, especially in these domestic, factors around, to buy it?
Well, thank you. I had a question for Anthony. Can you expand a little bit on your idea on carbon credits and this offsets and how that exactly would work? Because if I understand correctly, this is about focusing on, instead of the traditional offsets, say nature-based services, on actual projects where you would have a monitoring reduction of emissions. Would this be voluntarily? Companies would purchase this credits and put this money available for this project? How would that work? Can you expand a little bit?
Okay, Dr. Zainab, I'll let you take that one quickly.
Okay.
On Nigeria and South Africa.
Yeah.
So the question was, how to deal with a perceived lack of readiness from the emerging markets, the big countries, Nigeria and South Africa, particularly around the energy transition. And I use the word perceived because it sounds like the person who posed the question frames it as mutually exclusive, that just because these governments are emphasizing on the role of natural gas, it means that they're not quite open or preparing for investments in renewable energy industries or technologies. That is not my understanding. I think what they are saying is that natural gas is actually going to be vital to the transition. And there's actually a huge debate around the role of natural gas as a transition fuel, even in Europe. It's not quite settled yet. And I say that this is not mutually exclusive because when you look at clean cooking solutions, for example, LPG liquefied petroleum gas is a cleaner cooking solution than biomass, wood, and all of those things that lead to deforestation. So it's not mutually exclusive. And that is not my understanding per se. At the same time, I think the messaging could be much better coming from these countries, in the sense that there's a lot of work that they also need to do. So one point that I mentioned earlier, which I'm going to repeat, is around geological surveys, for example. Like, you cannot say that you want to attract battery manufacturing in your country and not have exactly, you don't even know what minerals or how much of them are under the ground, for example. So great, that would be my response.
Okay, back to the carbon credits. There are two ways to do it. The investors would evaluate projects, but this is really this is very US focused, because in Europe there essentially is cap and trade and a tax. I don't know what will happen in the UK, but I can just speak to the US. I don't think we'll have that kind of framework or that kind of legislation. However, we have that kind of moral imperative and a lot of incentive to move. And so if companies would take what essentially is their tithing, the difference between where they are and getting to carbon neutrality, put a dollar amount, which you can't put a dollar amount because you can put a dollar amount to a carbon price, which is approximate, but nonetheless you can do it. Multiply by the number of years that it's going to take you to get to carbon neutrality, and you have public-private conversions, if you will, that make the investments. But the truth is, the companies will care less about where it is. I don't mean they don't care at all, but honestly, do you think that they're making an evaluation between that offset of the forest in Uganda versus the carbon sink in the Amazon? They're not. They're just buying the units to meet their needs.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Thank you guys for joining us. I think I'm supposed to mention that there will be some kind of beverage outside. I think it's
Unknown.
unknown. No, it's not actually known. I think it's Prosecco. So thank you for your engagement and your questions. Please join me in thanking the panelists.